Good morning. Good morning to everybody. Thanks for singing with us. My name is Dan. I get the honor of serving as pastor of this church family that you're with today, and we're so grateful for that experience together as family. And today we get to kind of look at together what God has described to us in 1 Timothy, what the vision of a healthy church family is. We don't expect that every church that you pop into and decide you're going to become a part of is healthy. We also don't believe that we are a church that's healthy until we focus on being healthy, getting healthy, staying healthy, and all of those healthy elements come from the Scripture. God has designed the church, and then we see that God describes the church. He designed a healthy church, and then he describes a healthy church. So you're going to hear from me today, primarily from 1 Timothy chapter 5, start to kind of describe in detail a vision for a healthy church. How does a healthy church function? Of course, there are a lot of elements of a healthy church. This is just going to be a few, but it's going to be specifically about how we treat one another, and specifically how do we treat widows and elders among the church. By elders, I don't mean elderly. I mean elder, pastor, church overseer, and so on. Now, a classic, you may have known this. How many of you, let me ask you, how many of you have been a part of a church family on and off for more than 25 years? 25 years or more, would you raise your hand? Okay, so you might be able to identify with this. Over the years, there are conflicts in churches that are very much related to generations. Can you imagine that? Generational conflict. Now, it tends to be along the lines of older generations. They say, we need what's familiar. And that's what our kids need, and that's what our grandkids need. We need something familiar. And that sometimes leads them to say things like, or to believe things like, so let's leave things the same. Because if they're the same, they're familiar, right? And I also have heard people say, and just because it's different doesn't mean it's right or best, which is, of course, true. And then sometimes the worst version of we want something familiar sometimes sounds like this. We can't change that. We've always done it, finish the sentence, that way. We've always done it that way. So then the younger generation is pressing on the older generation, and they're saying we want something meaningful. And just because we've done something that way forever doesn't mean it's meaningful. In fact, the longer we've done it, the more we've kind of grown to lose what that tradition or that particular practice actually means. So we don't just want to do it the same way, we want to do something meaningful in a meaningful way. And then the younger generation might say, our familiar traditions, that although they're familiar, they've become the same, they've lost their meaning, it's time to change them. And then the conflict is swelling, the conflict rises. And then there's always a group among the church who are like single people, struggling people, and widow people who say, hey, while you're pressing for what you need and want, don't forget about us. We're struggling. We have needs. Our life has changed dramatically from what it was when we were really able to contribute wholeheartedly. So they might say, I think it's wrong to forget about the rest of the church, as the younger and the older play a bit of tug-of-war. So what's God's plan to address these conflicts? We know that new isn't always best. We know that empty traditions leave us desiring more meaningful connection with God and each other. What's God's design? How does he address this? He kind of describes some of that here in 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5 is a letter from Paul to Timothy, who's pastoring the church at Ephesus, and he's given him instructions on how to get rid of bad leaders, how to raise up good leaders, and how to cultivate a healthy church. And he essentially says this today: healthy churches function like a family. Now, let's stop here, because that word family can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Right? Legitimately means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. This word family, of course, Paul is describing the best version of your family Whether it's ever been that version or it could be that version, it's the best version, right? Paul is obviously not going to say healthy churches function like a family who screams in each other's faces and never forgives them for the damage they've done, right? We mean the healthiest version that gives cross-generational care to each other. And this reflects the gospel's new community that started to emerge in the church of Ephesus. And this new gospel community is replacing the church that was full of division and factions. And Paul is saying, this is how God has designed it. He's designed a church to be a place of belonging instead of divisions and factions. Here in 1 Timothy 5, Paul gives instructions. And he's going to give instructions to the different groups that are within the church, the older men and the younger men, the older women and the younger women. And I caution you this morning about trying to figure out which group you're in, older or younger. I caution you. Oh, believe it or not, here's a little bit of anticipation for you. At some point or other, the Bible, I'm not sure that, I didn't remember this was there. But in this passage today, Paul actually names a number that determines whether you're old or not. So hold your breath. Don't read ahead. Some of you who are reading ahead, don't read ahead, but also get ready. You're going to get a legitimate, specific number, and it's going to be divisive. It's going to be troubling. Now, don't forget, it's not my number. It's God's number. Then he is going to talk about widows and the church overseers, pastors, elders. And those instructions are going to be very specific. And I have to think that in some way that this is a little bit of a, it makes me wonder, is Paul making a case? Now, I was youth pastoring in the 90s, and you know what all the rage was in the 90s? All the rage was Generation Church. Now, I want you to picture this. I want you to picture a church like ours on Sunday morning telling all of the young people that we have church specifically designed for you every Sunday morning somewhere else. And then you extract all the 25 and unders out of the room and you put them somewhere else, and then you grow a church with that generation. And I can't help but read 1 Timothy chapter 5 and say, that's a huge mistake. That isn't what God designed at all. Does every single demographic have unique needs? We would say yes. But do we design a church specifically intended to gather one generation and then splinter them off in another part of the building and then have them never interact? We're going to see that that's not what Paul was describing, or what God was describing in the church of Ephesus. So there's various groups in the church family. Some of them, in this case, they're going to be kind of age demographics. And there's a specific way that we're supposed to treat each other. A very specific way that we're supposed to treat each other. He starts with this: treat each other like family. So, treat each other like family. So when you're trying to think, like, what is the church supposed to be like? It's supposed to be like family. And what that means is mostly being involved in a family is a source of love and getting a lift. But sometimes it's a source of pain and offense. So if you're involved in a church family, you should feel like being involved in that family gives you a lift. But there are occasions where it shouldn't surprise you, where you're like, oh, that didn't really sit right with me. I'd like to knock her out. I'm kidding. So here's what Paul says to Timothy. God's describing this church, and he says, never, Timothy, you're a young leader, but set this example: never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him, use respect, do it respectfully, as you would your own father. And of course, you can imagine that in this particular patriarchal Eastern culture, that the way that someone would communicate to their father is incredibly respectful with honor. Talk to younger men as you would your own brothers. So This interaction between generations in the church, I hope you can picture this. It should sound like you're at home. The best version of when you're at home. The best version. In other words, I kind of think of it this way. It shouldn't sound like you're involved in a cult when you're talking to other church members. It shouldn't sound like there's these pious words that are being exchanged that need some kind of decoding or translation. That when you're having conversations with your church family, it should sound so normal, authentic, genuine, affectionate, also familiar. Like, I know these people, I care for these people, I essentially, outside of my own home, live with these people. It's a familiar tone. It's a everyday life kind of vibe where people are communicating with each other among the church. This is how Paul describes it. Respect and treating younger men as your own brothers. Now, for some of you who treat your brothers a certain way, you have to upgrade this phrase. You have to picture it. You have to picture it in those lifelong, I am with you till the end, nothing's going to separate us type of approach in the way you treat each other. So then he goes on and he says, treat older women as you would your mother, and treat younger women with all the purity as you would treat your own sisters. So I think this helps us build a healthy intergenerational culture where the older are interacting with the younger, and specifically how to interact with each other. Men interacting with women, and so this answers the question, men, how should you? I mean, it wasn't too long ago in our culture where it was so hostile, men, the interaction between men and women kind of like in social media and the workplace or whatever, that it was tense for a while about like how do men even relate to women without offending them or somehow coming off a certain way. Well, here's what Paul says. Among the church, how do men treat women? Well, if they're older, treat them like your mom. If they're younger, treat them like your sister. And that really does help us understand how to interact, men, with women in the church. Long time ago, I remember when we were standing in a circle in the church shortly after service ended, and this is going to get cringy, just a warning, it's going to get cringy. We were standing in a circle of people, my wife and I were pastoring at a church, and there's an older man who's in the circle, and he says to my wife, "Oh, you're wearing your hair down today." Which is like, it's just an observation, maybe a family member would say that. And then he said, "That's how I like your hair best." Is that cringy? Ladies, that was so loud. There was so much unity there. That's how I like your hair best. So I stepped up in his face. You already know you're already laughing. I can't keep him with me for a split second on that one. So obviously it's like, ugh, what? Paul addresses this. I mean, men, you don't say that to your little sister. So it's probably out of bounds among the church family. Instead, you treat your sister with honor and respect, purity. Let your little sister's sisters or peers tell them about how they like their hair or what they wear. Men and women, at the same time, this means that men and women among the church do not have to avoid each other. Paul is not describing when you gather together on one side of the church, make sure you gather all the ladies. On the other side of the church, gather all the men, and make sure none of those men look over at those ladies. Paul is describing here an interaction between genders, saying these men and women are going to interact together, and when they do, you can have a conversation, be together, you can meet together, You can do that without fearing that somebody's going to accuse you of bad intentions. And that allows us to pray for one another. That allows men to pray for women and women to pray for men. How? Men, you're going to pray for the women among the church as if they are your mother or if they are your sister. And that provides healthy boundaries of the way that you interact with each other so that you even, you have biblical guardrails. Now, we know that the human heart is always at risk, but so are churches that build a wall of separation between male and female, where the men are over here meeting and leading and growing together, and the women are forbidden to mix with the men, and so they kind of don't know any pathway to interact with or to be cared for or to be known by leaders, and vice versa. So Paul also says among the church that there's going to be a group of widows and that the church should take care of your true widows. Widows are particularly vulnerable in an ancient world. If you're a widow in the ancient world that Paul is describing here, you don't have any social status. If you don't have any social status, you don't have any financial security. If you don't have any financial security, you're destitute. So the path to destitution in the Eastern world, the Middle Eastern world, is simply losing your spouse, a wife that loses her husband. So the church would take the role of caregiver for the widow, which is very consistent with Jewish traditions and what you would find in the Old Testament teaching on caring for the needy. So currently, this biblical approach, care for your elderly, remains embedded in cultures around the world. Around the world, Asian cultures, African cultures, Mediterranean cultures, indigenous cultures all elevate and go all in to care for their elders. Guess which culture doesn't? Ours, the Western culture. The Western culture elevates individualism, independence, productivity. And anytime somebody, even in your own family, becomes dependent, less productive, they can easily be kind of like moved aside. We have the rise of the institution in our church, in our culture. And so Paul is saying here that I don't think it's going to help the widows or the church if their own people are destitute. And the church culture, one way that the church culture and the church can really shine among the American culture is to take care of true widows. Do what it takes to provide what's needed for the true widows who are among you. So, interesting, you may have noticed that there's a qualifier on this. Do you notice that, right? Paul doesn't say take care of your widows. Take care of your true widows. So this gets dicey, because there's criteria that he describes for us. Here's what he says. Take care of any widow who has no one else to care for her. Therefore, doesn't it sound like he's saying, don't take care of every widow, take care of every widow who doesn't already have somebody to care for her. So essentially, I think you can hear him saying every single need in the church isn't taken care of by the church. There is some specific criteria. Check this out. But if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and to repay their parents by taking care of them. How many of you are looking forward to your kids repaying you? How many of you are like, I don't see it happening. I really don't. I'm not looking forward to it. I see it not happening. Now, I'm going to tell you something very, I'm going to describe something very dark. And I'm not sure exactly that Paul means it here, so I'm not reading into this, but this could be what he's saying. Do you know that in this culture, a newborn child could be rejected and ignored? That the father, in the patriarchal culture, the father gets to decide when and if that father receives that child into their home. And some of the commentators say that in this passage, this actually means repaying them for accepting them and receiving them into their home as a newborn because it's not taken for granted. Isn't that dark? So it's hard to say that Paul's injecting this here, but it could be, hey, don't forget, your parents, in this culture, your parents didn't have to select you. They didn't have to keep you. Some don't. And you know what? Check this out. This is true. The rejected children, where a patriarch did not select that child, it gave rise to orphanages that were staffed and built by one single demographic in the ancient culture. It's the Christian culture. Christians started the idea of orphanages to care for these newborns that had been rejected by their own families. Later on, you know that Christians also were responsible for the rise of hospitals and so on. Thank God for the compassion that comes through these texts. So at home, if you have someone who's at home, then Paul's saying that it's the responsibility of the family to take care of their widow. So we're going to get specific here, and we're going to look specifically. Paul says, what is a true widow among the church family? And what is that? What are we focused on taking care of? Now, a true widow, his words, is a woman who is truly alone in this world, right? They don't have their family able to take care of them. And has placed her hope in God. She prays night and day, asking God for his help. So, these widows would be experiencing, except for the help of the church, these widows would be experiencing the kind of the traditional experience of complete and total destitution, abandoned. And then Paul starts to kind of get really harsh with the idea that widows need to be taken care of by their family. Check this out. Check out this language. But those who won't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, have denied the true faith. I mean, wow. They can't even consider themselves gospel Christians if they don't take care of their own relatives, especially those who are within their own household. They've denied the true faith. Those people, such people, are worse than unbelievers. I mean, that's intense. Paul is getting intense in the urgency here. Now, one of the reasons is to make sure that these people are cared for, right, these widows. The other reason is because it protects the reputation of the church, right? The church, how could the church care for me? How could the church care for the world if they aren't even able, or they're struggling to care for their own widows? And Paul is saying, here's an opportunity to be salt and to shine brightly among a culture that throws away its infants and throws away its destitute widows. We aren't going to do that. Believers aren't going to do that. Christians aren't going to do that. We're going to be known for taking care of our own, even if it puts us out, costs us time, effort, and money. So, how does the church enforce this? This is really detailed. Paul says a widow who is put on the list for support. So evidently, in the ancient church, this new gospel church is emerging. There's a support list. It's a widow support list. This must be a woman who is at least, say it, 60 years old. Is this the number? Is it 60? Good news, this was a generic number used by writers back then, like Paul, to indicate in their older age. This isn't a specific number. And everybody said, thank God. Thank God. And by the way, as you get older, doesn't 60 get younger? I've told you that story, right, about how many times I have thought about when I was a teenager sitting at the dinner table and opening the paper and sometimes ending up with the obituaries, and I don't know why or how, but just flipping through them and being like, so-and-so died 62, so-and-so died 67, so-and-so died 71, and I was thinking to myself as a teenager, well, that is a good run. That's a long run. It's right in the expiration range. And then every year since, I look at those numbers and say, what? Are you kidding me? So in the Greco-Roman culture, 60 years old means the beginning of old age. It's when you start having those concerns that you would have when you're in the beginning stages. So this person, by the way, this widow, a true widow, is on the list. Who do we put on the list? They're at least 60 years old. They're faithful to her husband. She must be well respected by everyone because of the good that she has done. Let me summarize that. This person who's on the support list has been contributing. They are giving, good, serving. They trust God. They pray. They've been contributing to the community. And these 60-year-old widows are added to a support list. There's more criteria questions to consider. He goes on to say, has she brought up her children well? Has she been kind to strangers and served other believers humbly? Is she setting an example? Is she a model? Has she been a part of the family and a positive impact? Has she helped those who are in trouble? Has she always been ready to do good? Is she a Cowboys fan? Does she like the Yankees? So Paul is putting the church on notice, a church like ours, and that is pay attention, be alert, gather lists, make an effort to ensure that those who are in need are on the list, but only those who are in need are on the list. Paul is implying that there's limited resources, and those resources have to be given to people who have contributed, not people who have learned to live a lifestyle of taking. And the reason is because this prevents a system of abuse, and it limits the ability for those resources to be wasted, those limited resources to be wasted. Now, especially in the Greco-Roman culture, where ignoring a widow would otherwise bring shame to the reputation of the church family. So, there's another category, and this is a warning to the church, another category of a widow that should not be put on the support list. The younger widows should not be on the list. Leave them off because they're going to want to remarry. And Paul urges them. He says, look, they're going to have physical desires that are going to overpower them, their devotion to Jesus, and they will want to remarry. He's not saying that's a bad thing. He said they should move on and be married again, and they should start again. And it's too risky to put a young and able widow on a support list, and it strips them the incentive to work, it strips them the incentive to be married, it strips them the incentive to start getting through this grief and starting fresh and flourishing. Now, how bad might it get? If you put young widows on the list of support, how bad might it get? He says if they are on the list, they'll learn something. They're going to learn to be lazy. They're going to spend their time gossiping from house to house, meddling in other people's business, and talking about things they shouldn't. And Paul is writing this because of what they're experiencing among the culture and what's happening to young widows who are on the list and who are getting cared for in ways that debilitates them, enables them, and otherwise helps them learn to be dependent. And Paul says they can do it. They can move through this grief. They can, if they're young, they can move through this grief. I don't want to see them in perpetual singleness and dependence. I don't want to see them in perpetual freeloading, causing trouble, saying and doing hurtful things. So, what are the younger widows supposed to be doing if they're not on the list? So I advise these younger widows to marry again, have children, and take care of them in their own homes. Then the enemy will not be able to say anything against them. Again, the enemy will not be able to tarnish the reputation of the widow, the family, and their church family, because they will be highly invested and high contributors to the family. So Paul kind of has this picture for young women in Greek society, and he advises them, keep flourishing, keep contributing. Your life moves on. So Paul doesn't challenge women to social uprising, right? You don't read in this text that Paul says, make sure that you rise up and dismantle society's domestic norms. He says, wives should focus on, and in this particular case, remain focused on flourishing, helping their home flourish, helping their family flourish. One last group. How does Paul say to treat the elders and the pastors among the church? Here's what he says. Among these people, both reward and reprimand your elders. both reward and reprimand your elders. So what is a true elder? A true elder is selected by other church leaders. They are responsible for teaching. They have a minimum level of character, we call biblical character. They have credible influence, right? They have credible influence in their church. They have credible influence in their family. They have credible influence out in the marketplace. And they help to maintain the order, the structure, and the integrity of a church family. Now let's see God's detailed instructions for them. He says this: elders, pastors, elders, overseers who do their work well should be respected and paid well, especially those who work hard at both preaching and teaching. For the scripture says those who work deserve their pay. So Paul is describing here that pastoring a church shouldn't be and doesn't have to be a vow of poverty. There are factions of the church, ancient church, that to this day believe that to be a clergy is to take a vow of poverty, to live off the land somewhere as a recluse. So also we know that Paul doesn't ever instruct that if you were to aspire to church leadership, it's a pathway to wealth. It's everybody gets Robert Tilton's book, How to Get Rich and Have Everything You've Ever Wanted. Just become a church pastor. I remember I grew up in the day and age where at a Pentecostal church, as the pastor, you would receive on Sundays occasionally a Pentecostal handshake. Do you know what that is? That's someone hitting you with a handshake, but between your hands is a $20 bill. Now, inflation, it would have to be 50, wouldn't it? Not my numbers, that's the economic numbers. But the generosity of the church would be evidenced in very, very personal ways. But Paul is saying here, pay them respect if they're doing a good job, and also pay them a living wage. I remember being a part of a negotiation for a senior pastor at one point where the board was trying to figure out, like, how much do you pay a senior leader? Like, you have a few pastors, one of them is going to be kind of the main lead role. How do you pay them? And I remember the conversation eventually came to a number, and somebody on the board said, "Wow, how much?" And the number was given, and the person on the board said, I have never made that much money in my entire career. And someone across from them who knew them well said, "Well, how long ago did you retire?" 19 years ago, I retired. So the mindset there, of course, was, how much have I been paid? What was I paid 19 years ago? And it could easily kind of be infectious among the church that if there is a pastor leading a church, they have to be so spiritual that they're willing to do it for free. And that in some ways, that's the sacred way to lead the church, is some version of a vow of poverty. But the main question is, how can a church pay their leaders in such a way as they can focus on the work that they've been called to and set aside for, and not spend most of their time trying to figure out, how am I going to pay the bills? Where am I going to get another job? How in the world is it possible for me to continue on without getting loans and becoming entangled in borrowing? Or it's impossible to take any time off, or it's impossible to vacation or retire. So there is a happy balance. Our church, you should know, leads the effort to make sure that your pastors aren't living in poverty, and that there is a healthy amount of helping church leaders be able to focus on leading the church and not trying to figure out how to survive. And I'm grateful for that, and we've always been grateful for that. So don't forget, 2 ways to pay the church elders. Number 1, pay them with respect, pay them well. Also, there are occasions when the pastors are not doing a good job. They're harming the church, and the damage that they're doing needs to be confronted. Doesn't that sound like a thrill? Well, who does it? How do you do it? There are some specific instructions that healthy churches follow. And here they are. And now if I see you pick up a notebook and start writing down now these things, and you haven't done this in a long time, we have cameras. So here's what Paul says. He says, if there's accusations against elders who are not doing a good job, they're damaging the church, involved in some kind of sinful behavior, they're damaging the credibility, the character of the church family. There's 4 quick guidelines that help for an orderly and healthy challenge of a church leader. And it starts with accusations. Of course, these accusations must be examined properly. And of course, they shouldn't be immediately accepted. It's not uncommon, as you can imagine, for all of the church family to hear something on a regular basis about how terrible something the church leader did. Here's some instructions for how to handle it. Number one, be very cautious. Here's what Paul says. Do not listen to an accusation against an elder unless it is confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. So one-off accusations don't rise. But if there's more than one person separately with the same accusation, it starts to rise. It starts to be something that now should be considered somewhere by someone, right? Church leaders are highly visible. They are highly vulnerable. We recognize that. And they're vulnerable to adverse reaction or adverse actions that divide the church. And by the way, since social media and the interweb, the damage that can be done just by a comment in a thread, an accusatory innuendo, is pretty astonishing. Obviously, those people out there in the world who can be malevolent, I think is the same thing as malicious, not in good faith. You've heard this phrase, they've got an axe to grind. It's a personal offense, ill-willed, sometimes just whispering gossip. Gossip being transmitted on social media now is effortless, as I mentioned. Accusations that get distorted in no time, in 24 hours. So Paul is saying, give your leaders the same kind of protection that everyone else has. Don't listen to gossip about leaders unless you start to discover that it's not gossip, it's a serious accusation you've heard from more than one person, or that you've experienced along with someone else. If it only comes from one person, it could be dismissed. All charges have to be substantiated by 2 to 3 credible people if it's to be considered. So next he says this, be courageous. Those who sin, these are the elders, pastors, should be reprimanded. Have courage for reprimand in front of the whole church, and this will serve as a strong warning. Some commentators said, if it gets to the point where there isn't any repentance in private, make the confrontation in public. Now, I think it would rattle a church if every time the pastors are confronted for sin, it's announced to the church every Sunday. Would that be a rattling experience? If somebody says, hey, listen, Pastor Dan's not speaking today because we had to have a really, really firm conversation about the sin we've noticed in his lifestyle, and so he's not up here today. It's going to be a substitute, and maybe you'll see him next week. I think it gets a little bit strange. But what Paul is saying here, some commentators say what this means is, if you have approached your church leaders and there is no acknowledgement, no confession, no repentance, and no humility, this can and should be a public reprimand. That's intense. I think that's intense. So that if change is substantiated, then the church family has to have the courage to rebuke publicly. Now, that might sound cold and unloving. That might sound cringy and awkward as much as it does, but it must be done serving as a strong warning for the good of the church and for the good of the elder, and eventually. Now, Judaism strongly emphasized correction. Public rebuke in Judaism would be a final resort, a last resort. It would be only if private attempts had failed in Judaism. And this is where, some would say that this is where the modern church has lost its nerve. All the sins of the leaders are in secret, and they are always and forever ignored because the church leaders are too powerful, and there's retribution. And we can't abandon courage, but rather to lovingly confront those who are doing wrong. And a lack of fortitude is not loving. Isn't it true that as much as you don't want to discipline your kids, a lack of fortitude means a lot of trouble in the future? If you have teenagers and adult friends and coworkers and so on, if you don't have the courage to confront carefully and lovingly, it means bad news in the future. Whatever it starts now is not where it's going to end in the future. It's the same for church leaders who God desires for them to be reprimanded and at times publicly, but it would take courage. It's also not unloving of Jesus to correct. If you're following The Chosen, there's a season. In season 4, Jesus does some confrontation. And when Jesus confronts his disciples, he's confronting the disciples, and I was like, man, Jesus is mad at me too. This is intense. I mean, what's it like to have Jesus disgusted with you? It vividly portrays Jesus being disgusted with his disciples. He confronts them because he despises them? No, because he loves them and he wants to see them grow and mature and get healthy and purge this nonsense from their character. So it's not unloving of a church to have these experiences where there's a reprimand for eldership. It's not unhealthy. It's unhealthy if it's needed and it doesn't happen. So Paul also says, when this happens, be fair. Be fair. I solemnly command you in the presence of God and Christ Jesus and the highest angels to obey these instructions without taking sides or showing favoritism to anyone. So Paul's force and compassion here has to be because there's been a scandalous exercise of favoritism. Can you imagine the favoritism where somebody who is leading the church needs to be confronted, but they don't get confronted because there's bias and favoritism towards that powerful person? And that powerful person may have the power for retribution, but they go on destroying the church, and the Ephesian good old boys never actually make the confrontation. And the reason is because that leader is getting away with murder because there's bias and there's favoritism. And Paul says there's no favoring of well-loved, well-liked elders who are in sin and deserve to be confronted. Influential masters should be confronted. Powerful elders, intimidating angry men should be confronted. Have courage, but do so fairly. Be careful. Now, it's reasonable to say, aren't all church leaders going to be biased? They work with these leaders. They care for these leaders. They represent the church together. Aren't all church leaders going to be too biased? Aren't all church leaders going to kind of struggle with the dishonest or maybe even too lenient to reprimand their elder teammates? I think that's a reasonable question. But look what Paul says. You have witnesses who know what's going on. They see the favoritism that's happening. And these backroom deals where you're covering things up, we may not be able to see it. Your church may not be able to see it. But I got news for you, church elder. This is all happening in the presence of God and also Christ Jesus himself. And if that's not enough, the highest angels are there witnessing this. And they are looking for you to obey these instructions without taking sides. That should be compelling. The people may not know that bias is happening and favoritism is happening, but for goodness sakes, the Father, Son, Spirit, and the highest of all angels are witnessing the damage that's being done. And I believe this, and I'm sure that many of you believe this too. Eventually, the truth comes to the surface. And eventually, whether it's an explosion or if it's just some surgery that needs to be done, God sees it through. He sees it through. And Paul is saying, church elders and church members, you can help it happen in a healthy way. No favoring of powerful elders, influential masters, intimidating, angry men. Be courageous, be fair, be very, very cautious. And this is last, Paul says, be careful. Be careful. Never be in a hurry about appointing a church elder. How do you avoid a lot of this trouble for the church? Slow down. Be careful. Don't be in a rush to lay hands on a church leader and say, here's our new elder. Here's the new pastor elder of the team. Take your time. Be slow. There's a testing period. There's a long testing period where you're looking for character that doesn't put the reputation of the church on the line. It takes time. And Paul has a view here that ordaining an elder too quickly, who has not first been tested, makes the people who lay their hands on that person responsible too soon. Not enough maturity or testing. If they turn out to be ungodly or immature, it does damage. Among the church leadership here at North Central Church, we call that guarding the gate. Guard the gate. Be patient. Make sure that these leaders are put in place who have passed the test and who have demonstrated maturity and who have longevity and who have credible influence and biblical character. And they're not perfect, but they have the evidence. And what's required to do that is guarding the gate. So, what now? Well, I would like to invite you and challenge you that what Paul is telling the church is to deepen your participation among the church family. That might mean aspiring to church leadership. That might be prayerfully considering, I wonder if God has in my path aspiring to church leadership, to serving in new and different and deeper capacities. Also, I want to invite you to participate in the church family in a way that you think of the church as your family, in a way that means that you treat your church as family. On occasion, I come across, I have a conversation with somebody who's been attending our church for a long time, and I feel like that they're attending our church and that we have a church family together, and they'll say something to me like, Pastor, I am feeling so comfortable in your church. And it catches me a little bit off guard, and I say, your church? Don't you mean our church? They haven't crossed over yet. They believe that what they're experiencing together on a Sunday, or they're experiencing together in other ways among the church family, is simply visiting someone else's church or simply observing from the outside someone else's church. Sometimes they'll say, I'm hoping in the future to help out somewhere in your church. And I think to myself, it's been 8 months. It could be our church. Wouldn't it be great if it was our church? And sometimes there's legitimate reasons that they see it that way. But I want to invite you to deepen your participation in your faith family and ask God, is it time to think of this church as my church, our church? Are we a church family? And I recognize that people feel a different level of connection, a different level of belonging, but would you open your hearts and ask God, am I participating in the way that you have designed me? Is there more? Can I aspire in any way to serve? Can I aspire in any way to give? And if I give, I know that there are widows who need to be taken care of. There are needs that need to be met. There are leaders who need to be supported. There are ministries that need to happen, and it requires my investment. I have time to give, talent to give, treasure to give, and I do so because this is my family, a healthy family that God's designed for us to participate in. Let's pray together. Father, thank you today for teaching us